2024 is really an interesting year for a whole lot of reasons. Many elections, especially of concern for us here, is the South African election coming up in the middle of the year. American election later on in the year. The world is at war in a number of places. A whole lot of things that seemed improbable just a few short years ago, but there's certainly something in the air. And one of the people that does keep an eye on geopolitics as well as the South African scene is Dr. Frans Cronje, who heads up the Social Research Foundation. Frans, welcome back to the State of the Nation.
Mike, it's great to be here.
It's so good to have you. It's been too long.
Yeah.
And, let's kick off, Frans. You've recently gone viral with some of your views on South Africa's international geopolitical stance, if one would call it that, right? You've got some views on the situation in the Middle East. Share that with us.
Yeah, look, I think what we are seeing is the sort of final stages of the accelerating collapse of the ANC administration. And one of the best indicators of that is that the ANC and government used to be very strategic in how it went about projecting itself and the influence that it had. And a guideline, a rule, held to inside the party was you've got to move quite cautiously in seeking to advance your revolutionary objectives. Because if you move too quickly and too aggressively, the game is up. And particularly Western observers will begin to realize that the picture you presented in the West through the final years of the apartheid era and after 1994 of an essentially liberal Democrat order that could be regarded, as George Bush once put it, as kind of America's point country in Africa, that's not entirely true. And over several months, that's over the past 2 to 3 years, it's become increasingly apparent to observers in the Western world that the ANC is a hostile actor. The ANC's administration is a hostile actor, that it fronts objectives for hostile partners, and that it's quite effective in doing that. And I think that's a strategic mistake for the ANC and government, and a much wiser foreign policy approach, certainly one that I've advised at times, is to replicate more closely what we see in India, where the Indians don't take a firmly aligned stance in favor of the Western liberal democratic order. They don't take a firmly aligned stance against or in favor of Russia or China or anyone else. They've navigated a very effective middle ground to seek to draw advantages to India by trading the East versus West conflict off against each other. And I think in South Africa, the ANC's got that wrong. And the insight from that in and of itself is an interesting thing. But when you start making strategic mistakes like that, you start poisoning Western opinion against you to a point where you are seen as a hostile actor, not as an ally, but as an adversary. I think the costs of that to you as a government, as a ruling administration, will be immense. And it's one of so many markers. You could say the extent to which the ANC has alienated media opinion in South Africa, to which it's alienated civil society. Media and civil society carried the ANC on their shoulders to power 30 years ago. The extent to which the ANC has alienated the support of its own voters. We'll talk about some of the data on that later if you want to. The chief insight on the foreign policy is that, and the read from that for me is those mistakes start getting made in the late stages of administration collapse. And that's what we're seeing for the ANC in South Africa today.
So what you're saying is that there is a position which one could call, let's call it you use the Indian example, that would be a pro-India stance, which is to say, how do we navigate these choppy waters to the best interests of our country?
Yeah, exactly.
If you take one side or another, you better be sure that you're backing the right horse, right? If you feel that's your best pro stance, then that's great. So it feels like if one, looks at South Africa, if you say the best pro-South Africa stance is to sit in the middle sort of be friendly with the West and this term that Cyril keeps on pushing called the Global South, which makes no sense, but let's call it that for a second. We used to call it the Third World, but that's no longer the third, who knows. But it's basically BRICS plus and enemies of the West. Then they must have made the calculation that that side is going to prevail.
Yeah, well, calculations have been made, of course, but many ANC calculations of recent years, or going back several years, just on the domestic scene, the calculations the ANC made about what it needs to do in order to remain in power, for example, these calculations suffered from very serious analytical mistakes. They pursued populist or ideological objectives. Let's take a domestic one. Just make the example there, then we'll come back to foreign policy. ANC support over a period of almost 30 years here has risen first and then fallen on the back of the socio-economic circumstances of people. And the most important such circumstance is whether you have a job or not. But a great many policies introduced by the ANC in government have had the effect of making it very difficult for people to create jobs and particularly for poorer people to find them. The net consequence of that is that ideological considerations and populist considerations overrode the strategic best interests of the ANC. And that is the reason why it is now facing the prospect, certainly by the end of this decade, of national political defeat. Foreign policy, you can see in the same way. There's enormous advantage in South Africa maintaining sound and positive relations with Europe and America on the one hand, and Russia and China being more important on the other hand. We have, make one example, we have a great shortage of capital within the country. We can trade these two off against each other. These two sides, East versus West, both are extremely interested in what's happening in the South Atlantic. Our real estate along particularly our East Coast is some of the most valuable geostrategic real estate in the world. They build a naval base anywhere on Africa's East Coast and on the West Coast. I mean, sorry, I'm thinking about the US. Build on Africa's West Coast a naval base. The next stop is the East Coast of the United States. Now, this is an asset we own as a country. The best way to exploit the asset, to leverage the asset, is to have a foreign policy that says, listen, we wish to draw massive advantages for our own people, economic, capital flows, investment, and the like, by trading off this asset. What we do instead of that is we take an increasingly hostile stance towards Western countries, and we take almost prostrate ourselves in front of China, for example. If you read some of the commentary that South African government puts out on China, it really is, it's kind of cringe-worthy how sickly sweet the praise is. And it's just a serious strategic mistake that sees short-term considerations override long-term strategic common sense for the South African government. And when you get to the end state of governments or political parties, they start to break up, they start to fail, particularly if they were once really strong, really dominant. You'll see more and more of these mistakes starting to be made. And looking at the ANC administration in South Africa today, it's really wherever you turn, there are examples of these strategic miscalculations, and the consequence of which we see in the poll data, that this is a party that's now facing political defeat.
The way I see it, they're facing war on three fronts. If we're talking about the ANC, one is their political support, which we know, if one looks at the last local government election, which I understand isn't a general election, they do have slightly different dynamics. They polled below 50%. The other one is historical, ideological ties and perhaps leanings, if one could call it that, from the historical perspective. And the third one being their own funding, which has been chaotic for 20 years. You bundle that all up, and one starts getting a picture as to what may be driving them. And, it may be something we'd want to come back to, but obviously their biggest action by far, if we thought that it was their role in supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine was quite a bold call, if one should call it that, their decision to go to the International Court of Justice and lay a charge against Israel for genocide was quite a big call.
Yeah, well, let's start a bit with Russia. On Russia, as you know, I might have done it on your show last year. I did it on a few others. I advised far more sympathy for the ANC position than what I'd necessarily do on its relationships with Iran. At the very least, and here, the world's become so polarized and divided, you make these remarks and triggers all sorts of feedback for you. But the ANC's read, in part on the Ukrainian conflict, is that NATO had been projecting power, we get the bearings right, eastwards, to a far greater extent than its initial commitments in the aftermath of the collapse of the Berlin Wall had been. And that there was a read that circumstances were being created on the eastern front of Ukraine to allow Ukrainian regulars to see if they could drive through that front and cut off the Crimea and the very important Russian port at Sevastopol. Now, in our increasingly polarized media and also in Western media, that line of argument was very much depressed. And few people heard it. And all I say is it deserved a hearing, because I think there was some merit to it. And that was certainly the view within the ANC and in the South African government. There was also, I think, initially an understanding that Western support for Zelensky would eventually fail, which it is now doing. And that the Ukrainians couldn't possibly sustain the offensive against Russia, and that in the end the West would betray Zelensky. Now, you wouldn't see much of that in traditional Western media, but amongst people who know these things, the end game that we're starting to see now was always the way this conflict was going to end. It was going to end with essentially a stalemate, then a compromise. Russia would get the east, it would get some degree of security over the Crimea, and Zelensky would and his Ukrainians would ultimately be betrayed by the West. Now that's exactly how this conflict is going to end. And for the ANC, given the position that it took, therefore, the damage is relatively initially limited. On the conflict in the Middle East, the stakes are very different. Iran is an actor that uses this ring of fire of military proxies to surround Israel with a view to destroying it completely. And Israel is an outpost of the Western liberal democratic order in a very hostile environment, qualified only by the extraordinary security measures the Israeli state needs to take given the neighborhood in this little slither in this otherwise very hostile environment. Why the Israeli conflict is important is that if the signal sent to Iran and its proxies is that we will allow you to succeed in threatening and later possibly collapsing this outpost of the Western liberal democratic order, the implications for liberal democratic societies around the world are very serious. And any actor that plays a role of serving as a proxy for that kind of assault against the Israeli state will be tarred with the consequences. In South Africa, Iran has proxies, and Hamas is an Iranian proxy. The Houthis are an Iranian proxy in the Red Sea. And they fight a physical battle of missiles and rifles and things. But warfare can be fought in very different ways. And the Iranian proxies do not have the ability to override Israel's military. They don't have the power to do that. They can't actually win. They can't overrun the Israeli state, particularly if Western support and US military support for Israel is sustained. Part of the strategy to change that balance of power is to wage a diplomatic war, an ideas war, against the idea of the Israeli state. And that's done with two objectives in mind. The first is to damage Western perception of Israel to a point where young liberal Westerners increasingly begin to question whether their government should be supporting the Israelis, and from there, aid to Israel will be made increasingly conditional to a point that it hems in the ability of Israel's battlefield commanders to see off the physical proxy threats from Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis, others in Syria and Iraq as well. And that's a very, very effective attack against Israel, and it might just have the effect of succeeding to an extent. The second branch, if you think of it as that of the idea war against Israel, is to stigmatize young Jews through their association with Israel and its defensive actions, to a point where consensus amongst young Jews, particularly young Israelis, about service in the IDF begins to fracture. And if that fractures and resistance builds up and the thinking becomes, do I really want to be tarred with this? Do I really want? It's just easier to go live in New York. We can have a great life there, but let's just give up on the Israeli thing. If foreign military aid becomes very conditional, increasingly conditional, and internal Israeli consensus on security measures fractures, then you start to develop areas of parity between Israel and Iran's proxies where Israel might, in the fullness of time, actually be overrun. And I do believe that is a prospect. I don't buy entirely the idea that since 1948 Israel has seen off attack after attack. It's somehow cloaked in this incredible ability to do that. Some of even those historical instances, the Israelis came very close to being in very serious trouble. If the role of the South Africans in helping to prosecute the ideological war against Israel succeeds to an extent where in a potential global future, Israel is overrun and destroyed. It's bastion of the liberal order destroyed. The implications for South Africa, its position, its reputation in the world, is very much more significant than its flirtations with the Russians might ever have been. And I think it should be troubling, therefore, to anyone who wishes to see South Africa sustain its position in the world as itself a liberal, democratic bastion in what is also a pretty hostile region, not anywhere near the scale of the Middle East, that the South Africans are acting recklessly in terms of the foreign policy influence they are exerting around this conflict. It's a price if the effort succeeds, and the horrors that would accompany the future overrunning and collapse of Israel. It's a price for which the reputation of the country in the liberal democratic world will perhaps never recover, and therefore it's something that I think South African observers need to be a little bit more circumspect about and think through the implications of, and perhaps go back to what my opening remarks to you were about South Africa's foreign policy, where the ideal to achieve is a national interest foreign policy that seeks to shape very constructive relationships with China, with Russia as well, with Western Europe, and with North America. But for a small little actor like ourselves to be so firmly aligned and so very influential in a conflict that could have such utterly grave implications, I think is foolishness. And we would do well to reconsider the position.
So the situation in the Middle East echoes the situation we had in South Africa in the 70s leading into the 80s, where I suppose the Nordic countries performed that role of, completely delegitimizing South Africa and the old South Africa and its policies.
It's very much graver. And it's very much graver than anything that's happening in Europe around Ukraine and the like. Russia ultimately should be positioned, I think Western strategists should look at Russia as a kind of bulwark against China and ultimately cultivating Russia to be more of a Western ally. It won't be a complete Western ally, but that's not too difficult to do. And I think the manner in which the Western media presented Russia's actions, bearing in mind, as is true in Gaza, that wars come with terrible human suffering. We seem to have, a colleague of mine makes the point that the Western world seems to have forgotten what it describes as genocide is just the horror of war.
Yes.
This is what wars do.
Yeah, it's the horror of war caught on camera.
I think the implications of go back to my earlier point, the implications of the Russian conflict, serious as it is, are limited. In the Middle East, what you have coalescing around Iran is actually a serious threat to the Western liberal order. If it is able to succeed in overrunning the little island of democratic order in Israel, the West is the objective beyond that. And a nuclear-armed Iran should be understood as a threat, orders of magnitude beyond anything that Putin's efforts in Ukraine amount to, and themselves orders of magnitude beyond the implications of the South African transition of 30 years ago. We actually, therefore, on the question of Iran, have to do here with a factor and influence on the order of the world that seriously threatens the miracle of the Western liberal democratic order and the wonderful rise in freedom and living standards that it's brought wherever it's been applied. And it's for that reason that I think be circumspect, regardless of the ANC is perfectly entitled to its position on the Palestinian people. There's also been advice I've given to let's call it the Jewish side on this. It's a historical position. It's a position they must be allowed to maintain. It's perfectly legitimate for them to do so. It's totally unfeasible and unrealistic to think that you'll alter that position. The ANC will become Zionists. They're not going to do that. And they shouldn't do that either. That's not their historical position. And that's not the issue. And I think too many South African observers who become quite animated around this conflict should understand that position is legitimate, maintained for the ANC. Absolutely fine. No one should think they could change it, nor should they try to, I think. However, it is an entirely different order of things to advance an Iranian global objective, whether you are a useful idiot in that or not, given the utterly grave implications for the Western liberal order of that. I think what Iran represents to the world is very dangerous to the Western liberal world, really dangerous. And the South African flirtations around Russia and Ukraine are should be seen entirely, implications entirely less than what's happening in the Middle East at the moment.
What is the Iranian objective?
Well, the Iranian objective would be to defeat the Western liberal order in its entirety. I don't believe that's nearly the Russian objective. I think there's far more common ground, a common space on that. But the Western liberal ideal arising from the Enlightenment and the Reformation is what makes Western societies so amazingly good. You know, they get knocked by their own governments now, climate change and all of that. But there really is not any prospect even of a debate about whether Western liberal democratic societies have brought about standards of living, comfort, and human safety on a scale just utterly beyond anything that compares in human history. And why is that? It's because coming out of the Reformation and the Enlightenment, the Western liberal democratic order stumbled upon something completely unique. It valued the idea of the individual as something of real value and importance. I'd say every other political culture sees a group dynamic where one group, an identity, you've got often an ethnic or religious identity, causes you to be racked permanently in a conflict with another group. And the purpose of that is for the one to override and dominate the other. And until the Western order came along, there was really nothing wrong with that. What was wrong with, why was it wrong to enslave someone? And the correct answer isn't that it wasn't nice or nasty. This isn't a serious moral answer. The first time the world really had an answer to that is when the idea of the individual was valued. Because by enslaving them or overriding them or destroying their culture, whatever the case might be, you were violating something important, which was the sovereign right of the individual to choose how they wanted to live, as long as they didn't do damage to anybody else. That is totally unique to the Western liberal order, and it's the most valuable thing. What Iran represents, and China to a lesser extent, is the polar opposite. We will group the world back into these warring, in their case, religiously dominated orders, and the purpose, moral virtue, will be for the one to utterly destroy the other. And in that sense, what Iran represents to the world, particularly nuclear-armed Iran, what China will begin to represent to the Western order is something that's very, very dangerous. And if you go along with some of what I'm trying to communicate with you in this talk, the position we took on Russia is not that to anything near the same extent. And I just have not just the sense, but the very firm view that, as in the same way that Israel shouldn't take its existence for granted, and I don't think it does, certainly not after October the 7th, I don't think the Western liberal order should take its dominance for granted either. I think it faces a serious ideological onslaught. And grave implications. And we've had a useful series of windows into that in this present conflict, the horrible conflict that's happening in the Middle East.
The biggest, probably the biggest triumph of the Western liberal order was the unlocking of the potential of the individual, which has led to unsurpassed progress.
But when the individual became a valued thing, you were free to think.
Yes.
You didn't have to believe that the Earth or the sun or whatever was the center of the universe. You could say it's not. We sit on the corner of a tiny corner of a galaxy that's one of several others. And you wouldn't be burnt at the stake for that.
Yeah.
And when you freed people up to think for themselves, to be themselves, that's where the West developed this the competitive advantage.
Yes.
That allowed it to deliver this. You see sometimes on YouTube and so these young kind of American college kids whose own lives represent an absolute pinnacle of safety and comfort, racked with anguish and horror at the kind of society in which they have to live. It really is the most extraordinary thing to see. And if but you mustn't, the Westerners are, you meet them from time to time, had this hiatus after the end of the Cold War, where I think a dangerous sense developed that the West had won, that the Western order had overcome, that it had seen off the then Soviet threat. Soviet threat was nothing on the scale of what Iran and China might yet present to the West. And you think those young kind of American college kids and how much they don't know, and how, utterly horrific it would be if a point were ever reached where they or their children or their grandchildren realized that the complacency, and hostility that their parents, grandparents had harbored on these American university campuses towards the ideals of the societies of which they ironically formed part, that hostility had set into motion a chain of events that seriously threatened. The Western liberal order is a unique, tiny little flash of safety and comfort in thousands of years of human history. Don't necessarily be complacent that it will continue to stand out. It's unique, it's very vulnerable, and that is a window you get out of the South African position.
So one can half understand, if that is the right word, the Iranian position, because Iran is a theocracy. It's an old theocracy struggling for relevance in a modern world, because the modernity has even reached Iran, and let's not forget that they've got political problems of their own. They're driven by two things: their hatred of Israel and the Quran, which sort of it sort of compels them to do what they're doing in the eyes of the theocrats.
Yes, well, Iran's doing exactly what it must do to survive.
Yeah.
It is doing what it must do to survive, and it faces many threats. You're completely right. One is the danger of people within that society becoming frustrated at the limits that are placed on their individual freedom. Yeah. But Western strategists, but particularly those that never had Cold War experience themselves, tend to make a mistake of thinking that powerful administrations in the rest of the world, informed by a very different worldview, are vulnerable to succumbing to Western temptations. Yeah. So the idea of offering inducements, yes, we'll limit the sanctions, yes, we'll be open to an Iranian nuclear program, because then you on the other side, you'll become more reasonable. I think it was the great who died last year and had such an amazing life, Henry Kissinger's sort of single major mistake was the view on China, that if China was engaged with in a positive manner, then the danger that it potentially posed to the world would dissipate. And I think that's incorrect. I think dangerous, autocratic, whether they're theocracies or not, regimes cannot be indulged. They need to be countered. And to counter them, you need to develop a deterrence ability. Yeah. And a deterrence ability in the Middle East, if you don't speak to an American college kid, but to some actual experience of that region, means the ability to demonstrate that if you threaten us, we are able to hurt you in response. And if you threaten us terribly, the consequences for you can also be terrible. And if you balk at that, you simply surrender the Israeli liberal democracy to the theocracy, and then that's not where it stops. That's the danger. That's not where it stops. From there, it spreads into the Western world, and it's foolishness that so many Western, well-intentioned, because call them perhaps even liberal thinkers, are not able to see the implications and are not able to see the dangers and play them out to their inevitable conclusion.
Although it does feel like with the actions of the Russian invasion of Ukraine as the kickstarter of a more muscular response and a more reasonable response for many of those European countries especially.
Yeah, look,
seems to have awakened, and certainly this Israel problem. I mean, it's definitely moved the needle, hasn't it?
I don't think it was really that. At the time, it was very difficult to convince people of that. I found, people, perhaps firms you spoke to, were quickly dismissive. But the call on that conflict early on was that Russia will win and Zelensky will lose, because the West was not, to be firmly committed, you're in this for the long haul. They were not in it for the long haul. There were various reasons for short-term expedience and the like, but the manner in which this conflict is now drawing to a close, and which I predict will draw to a close over the next several years, is stalemate, and ultimately, it will be dressed up as something else, is Western betrayal of Zelensky and of the Ukrainians, and Russia will get what they wanted. So I don't think it was more muscular. I think Russian strategists understood all along that the West can't be in this for the long run, and they're going to break, and they're going to fold. And I think there are very dangerous signs of that in the Middle East too. I think some of the remarks made by and advice given by senior American officials about terminating this conflict as quickly as possible are dangerous for the survival of the Western democratic order. They do not demonstrate staying power. That China will be watching very closely with a view to Taiwan, which I predict for you, if a muscular response does not materialize, Taiwan will be encircled and slowly strangled, and that little bastion of the liberal order will also die out. The Chinese will just keep an eye on November to see who wins in America before.
Let's talk about China in a little bit of detail, because the one hallmark of China as a society, and it's obviously got a very long history, is it's hard to see. You can understand what Iran's objective is. You could understand what the Soviet Union's objective was 50 years ago. China's objective seems to be a little less clear. I mean, China built their wall to keep people out. They have always been an insular society. Even though they're a very big society, they've never really taken to empire building as such.
Yeah, my read on the Chinese is this: is that you move from Mao and the destructiveness to Deng and the enormous adulation and the miraculous success of China in eradicating material human suffering. And I mean, globally, China just moves the dial on poverty and does more faster for improving the basic living standards of people than I think Westerners understood the implications of. But the Xi administration increasingly began to realize that the Chinese were now boxed into a terrible predicament. That as living standards began to rise and were then transferred high living standards from generation to generation, it was probable that you would see growing demands for more representative government. When the Hong Kong protests were an issue 2 years ago or so, and the Chinese state cracked down on those so absolutely harshly and with such incredible brutality, the reason was the fear that if an example of just a single bastion of resistance is allowed to be, it will be infectious, and the whole urban middle-class East Coast in time will erupt in little democracy protesters. And what had been the Chinese miracle of merging autocratic political influence with near-anarchic capitalist expansion would be broken, and the Chinese state would collapse. So Hong Kong is extinguished with ruthless brutality. And the Xi administration, prior to that, and increasingly quickly subsequently, invests in creating a security state of immense tech surveillance and interfacing tech with social control in order to head off this risk. And that the strategic call that's made in the upper echelons of the Chinese Communist Party is that there will be a payoff now between innovation and success and Chinese competitiveness and political control. Because the net we are casting to dampen and squeeze out and prevent what would be a democracy movement ultimately will catch in it, regrettably, economic innovation, thought and the like. And we will become less competitive relative to the Western world, which has great strategic and security implications for China. But there was no alternative, because simply allowing the anarchic capitalist expansion to continue and not hammering the first little nascent green shoots of democratic activism would have also led to the collapse of the post-Deng Chinese model of the autocratic control and the amazing economic expansion. And so what the Chinese did is they bet on they bet on control at the cost of growth, and for a very long period of time that will probably ensure the dominance of the Communist Party in China.
But they're still dependent on Western markets taking their goods.
Yeah, to an extent. These things are, look, in a talk like this, we can talk about the extremes of things in over time, and these things play out over decades. There is a certain amount of operating space and leeway available for political leaders or government leaders and policymakers to operate within the extremes that we set out. But ultimately, however, the lesson of history is that where governing administrations cannot meet the expectations of their people, they are ultimately challenged and subsequently dethroned. And the call that, despite the amazing abilities of the Chinese surveillance state, the track that Xi has put it on must, in the fullness of time, could be a very long time, culminate in a similar set of challenges to the authority of the Communist Party there. But all that is, Michael, is just the order of things. I mean, this isn't particularly profound at all. All we are saying is that systems evolve towards different states of relative stability and evolve back and forth over time. And the idea, therefore, which we've mentioned earlier, that the end of the Cold War marked a new era in which one set of views had won and triumphed and would forever be dominant, that's just wrong. And the conflict between the West and Iran and Israel and the moves the Chinese are making are just perhaps the most prominent theaters in which the future trajectory and the balance between more authoritarian views of the world and those that value the sovereign importance of the individual are being seen.
Now, Frans, one can say that in all three instances, or in the case of this let's call it alliance, Iran, China, Russia, there's one factor that sort of binds them all, and that is They've got older leaders who seem to have stamped out any competition. You've got two 70-year-olds in Xi and Putin. You've got a 1,000-year-old theocrat in charge of Iran. And it doesn't feel like there's natural progression, succession.
I don't think that's a problem. I don't entirely buy this thing of these old leaders. I mean, you look at Biden in America and his rival now, Mr. Trump, given that Mr. DeSantis has thrown in the towel and that Ms. Haley, regrettably, in my view, is lagging Mr. Trump by a considerable margin. Even in somewhere like New Hampshire, which is really where if the Haley team had a chance, you'd expect her to win by some way. But remember that people used to sort of die when they were in their 20s and 30s. And you know, maybe when we were sort of born, died when they were in their 70s. Now live to be 100. So in the relative order of, and more, in the relative of order of things, the fact that the average age of leaders, and if you sort of averaged out the US and Russia and China, would be in the 70s and the 80s, I don't think is as much a problem as what it's often presented as in the popular media.
I think the point that I'm making is less about their age and more about the fact that they've been ruthless in stamping they've almost become dictatorships.
Well, they need to be dictatorships to head off the threat of either a dissatisfaction with declining material circumstances, or the demand for greater democracy, where material circumstances rise quickly, challenging the.
But the point is,
does somebody administrations that they're part of?
Do they have people that would take over from them and continue?
Oh yes, completely. I have absolutely no doubt of that. That there'd be highly effective succession strategies in place. I don't think the age, and I don't think the story of succession is necessarily. Of course, where you do have a leadership succession from a once dominant dictator to someone else, you have an opportunity to change the direction of that country or society. So it presents an opportunity, but I don't think it's reason to think that the trajectory of those societies are on balance of any probability set to alter fundamentally once their present leaders are no longer there.
Well, Dr. Frans Cronje, this has been absolutely brilliant, and we haven't yet touched on the impact for South Africa with the upcoming election, and we'll be dealing with this in part 2. So if you've enjoyed this, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Frans Cronje. Please subscribe to the State of the Nation channel, and please tune in for part 2, where we're going to deal with the impact on the South African politics, especially with the election coming to us in later this year. So thank you all for joining us on the State of the Nation.